level. And there's also challenges in terms of the quality standards. In terms of, if you want to participate in a global donor market, you need to reach a WHO standard, but that also involves significant costs, which can, but the challenge then is to become competitive vis-a-vis production elsewhere, especially given many health policymakers in the short term have a limited budget to play with, and for that budget want to get, for understandable reasons, as much drugs of good quality as they can for that budget. And if it's not always the case, but if, and it is in many cases, locally produced drugs might be more expensive in the short term than imported products, then for many health policymakers, there's a sort of immediate attractiveness to importing from elsewhere. So just as I start to finish, there's a quote here from a company pharmacist in Nairobi about Indian competition, somebody I interviewed. It's a big challenge for us. One of the difficulties for local production inputs, raw materials are there with them, as are the packaging materials. They have, we don't. It is more expensive to get the raw materials here. Local transport is also quite high. Companies in India are huge. Maybe 5 Kenyan companies are one of theirs. If buying in a large scale, the price will be lower. In India, they think about their local industry. So this is just a brief overview from some of the insights of my research on both India's pharmaceuticals and local manufacturing. There's, of course, significant interest in local manufacturing, but the big challenge is to work out the policies, not just to actually initially set up companies or to finance the initial manufacturing, but to make them competitive and to provide markets for them in a medium term to longer term context where there is a guaranteed purchase, for example, through procurement, or that they have support to be competitive in the market context vis-a-vis the incredibly difficult challenge of competing with companies from India and China, which have come to dominate the pharmaceutical industry, not just in the African context, but also in many other contexts elsewhere. And this, I think, dynamic of promoting local manufacturing, supporting it, but making it competitive vis-a-vis particularly production in India and China, applies more broadly for the pharma industry. It applies to the current interest in COVID-19 vaccines. And although I haven't spent considerable time researching it, I believe it's also a significant challenge, but also the key issue to try and overcome, including in the context of anti-epileptic drugs. So I'm going to stop there and come back to you all.
Thank you, Dr. Horner. That was a really illuminating presentation and lots of different variables to think about. And I think with the advent of COVID, it's really, caused reflection on capacity, infrastructure, thinking about long-term development and what needs to be done. What I'd like to do is open the floor to questions for Dr. Horner. So Professor Kisanu, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Rory Horner. It's really very nice talk. My question is about the quality price of these products made in India, in China, in many countries. Because sometimes I visited some factories in India because we had collaboration between Morocco and India. And also in Morocco, we are producing many medications and also good trading with some African countries. So what's this point of quality price of these products?
It's a good question. I think Morocco has actually got one of the few countries it's actually up in the top 3 in terms of recipients of vaccines from India in terms of the current COVID vaccines exported so far. Anyway, quality is a really good question, and it's a very frequent question that I get asked in doing this research. There's a perception about Indian drugs and their quality. My usual answer is that Indian companies can produce drugs at all quality levels, from the best quality standards in the world, and in the largest number of US FDA approved plants in the world outside America is in India. So there is drugs being produced to very high quality standards in India. There's of course many drugs being produced to WHO pre-qualification standards, which are required to supply the global fund. But there are also Indian firms who I've interviewed who they have told me that one of the attractiveness of supplying to some African markets is there is much less regulatory challenge, and there are much less barriers to entry, and primarily through regulation. And in one interview, a relatively vivid example, somebody running a company told me, well, we literally take drugs on a backpack to Africa and start selling them. I mean, that's a pretty scary thought, but it happens even within the Indian domestic market. Companies produce one drug for the domestic market to whatever standard is needed, and might produce the same drug to a much higher standard for elsewhere. So a lot depends on the regulatory pathways that are in place. And there's basically three main regulatory channels through which Indian drugs reach Africa. One is through global donors, which is for antiretrovirals, antimalarials, it's TB drugs. One is through national governments, direct to national governments for public procurement. And the third one is direct to the private market. And the public procurement depends, of course, on the particular country, but the private market is the one where you're most likely to see low quality drugs. But a lot is dependent on the regulatory channel, because the manufacturers basically adapt themselves in accordance with whatever the regulatory channel they're going through requires. And they don't see it as attractive to produce at a higher quality standard than is necessary, because that may make the production more expensive than is necessary. So they, to me, completely adapt and produce at a whole variety of standards.
Yeah, and also another question, because I compared some medications, for example, some Princeps medications like we have in Morocco. Sometimes the generics are just 10% of the price. So is it that the generics are much cheaper, or maybe the Princeps, the original drugs, are too much expensive, and the companies are taking a lot of money from countries depending on this medication because they are not able to produce such medications?
I think it's a case everywhere that generics are significantly cheaper, and generics do more reflect accurately what the manufacturing cost actually is. A lot of the costs of originated, and to some extent some branded products, are much more reflecting marketing and advertising costs than actually the pure manufacturing cost. So it's more, I think generic, it's not just in Africa that's the case. There's a big gap in many cases, and sometimes the manufacturing cost is relatively lower for other drugs, but for generic drugs, manufacturing is key.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kisani. I'm going to give the opportunity for one more question before we bring on Dr. Helen Cross.
Yes, thanks. I'll take that opportunity. Thanks so much. Thanks. Great presentation, Rory. I've got a question, not a very big one, but important nonetheless. You talked about raw materials. Where do raw materials come from, especially for two drugs that I'm interested in, phenobarbital and carbamazepine? That's my first question. The second one, can they also be raw materials for those medicines in Africa?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of, I mean, this is slightly, and I don't mean to be flippant about this, but it's almost like many other industries. A lot of things that are manufactured come from China, and people, of course, exaggerate this, but in the pharmaceutical industry, it is really key. And it is, I mean, the production of some raw materials and APIs it's really it's really pollution and chemically intensive. These are chemical reactions and chemical processes that are done. And to give an example, in a number of the places where this still does exist in India, it's largely beside the coastline, and where there is a pipeline to, after the common effluent treatment processes have taken place, to discharge the waste a number of kilometers out into the ocean. You actually very rarely get API production in inland, or there used to be it used to be in India, concentrated near Hyderabad, which is inland, but there's been a ban on essentially API production there for over 20 years now, and it's all moved to the coastline. So it highlights how, and in the only API in Africa is in Port Elizabeth in South Africa on the coastline too. So it's not a very pleasant kind of industry, and there are many. There's talk again in Europe now about having more API production, but I'm not sure when it comes to the reality, will many countries both put up the cost, but also be interested in the environmental impact that also comes with this production. Unfortunately, I don't know specifically for the two drugs you mentioned to say anything more, but there are, all I can say is there are not that many exceptions to this broader pattern. So yeah, it's a really good question though.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Horner. And I'm sure if people have other questions or comments, they can carry on placing them in the chat. But to move on in the interest of time, I'd like to